Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I presume all of you haven't wandered around too much before getting here, so really glad to see all of you. Let's open with a song, right? If you'll come along with me, we're going to class to study history. We may not get from A to Z, but we shall see what we shall see, okay? You ready? Nancy Bain is up there at the piano and she's ready to go, and I hope you're ready to go. You ready to sing? I mean, let's hear you. I mean, we might turn you into a whole choir, and you'll rival the new men's chorus. Okay, well, let's hear it from Nancy. Nancy, are you there? Okay. If you will come along with me, we're going to class to study history. We may not get from A to Z, but we shall see what we shall see. Hey, that's great. That's great. You did it so well. Let's do it again. This time, I want to hear you. Can I really hear you this time? Let's see what happens. Here we go, Nancy. If you will come along with me, we're going to class to study history. We may not get from A to Z, but we shall see what we shall see. That's great. All right, I want you to sing one more song before we plunge into some things today. On your, not your last page, that's on the back of the page, the third stanza down. It's about all I've got with regard to today's lecture. It's to the tune of In Old New York, from Victor Herbert's The Red Mill. I think it's from that. So anyway, so we'll sing the verse that starts with, while all of this was going on, Europe began to change. Do you have that in front of you? Or did you leave your syllabus at home? Okay. Third stanza of the song In Old New York. Nancy, maybe you ought to play that tune for us. Okay. Okay, we have two lines in there that apply to today's lecture. Great Gothic arches soared above in this town and in that. That's all, but we'll sing the whole thing, okay? All right, here we go. Everybody ready? While all of this was going on, Europe began to change. Cities sprang up, merchants appeared, and banks were all over the range. Great Gothic arches soared above in this town and in that, and students flocked to many a school. The goose was fat. All right, so much for a little folderol. We'll get it here today. What you see on the screen right now is the chantry of a parish church, in fact, the second largest parish church in England, Tewkesbury Abbey. Tewkesbury Abbey. Tewkesbury Abbey is over near Wales, and that section of England. What you see on the screen is not what you would see in the 12th century. You don't get to something quite so elaborate as that until considerably later. The progress of architecture will be from Romanesque, and the word Romanesque simply means Roman-like. And these were buildings church buildings that were low. The walls were very thick. The windows were very small. The whole affair, the whole architectural affair, gives the impression of a fortress. Almost something that is to be defended, and so the transition from early churches that really were like churches that were built as fortresses is a transition from Romanesque to Gothic. Now it will be the Normans who will introduce what's called a Norman Romanesque and Norman Gothic cathedrals. I'll show you some examples of those in just a few minutes. One of the things that we will notice is that the Normans will begin almost immediately after 1066 to put up these Norman church structures. And so they're called Norman Romanesque and Norman Gothic. You move into the Romanesque is from about 1066 until the Romanesque church is from about 1066 to 1150. And then you have three stages of Gothic architecture in England. And the architecture is mainly churches. And those three stages are Early English, which go from 1150 to 1250, and then you have the middle or Gothic period, sometimes called the decorative period of Gothic architecture, which goes from 1150 to 1250. And then you have the perpendicular or the high Gothic in England, which is 1250 to 1350. And we will see some structures that cover all those periods in the slides that we're looking at today. What you see here, Tewkesbury Abbey, I said, is not a cathedral. I simply an attempt to show you a ribbed vaulting in churches, and that you'll begin to see that in some of the slides at some of the buildings that we'll be showing you today. I might mention to you that I am indebted to a colleague of mine who passed away not too long ago, Dick Dilworth. When I used to teach medieval history at VCU, I lecture on cathedrals, but at the time when I first started lecturing on the cathedrals in the 60s, the mid-60s, I'd never seen a cathedral. And what was happening in the late 60s as I was teaching about this, and I was teaching out of photos that I'd seen of cathedrals in books and read about them, and I would come on and complain to my wife. I'd say, Miriam, this is getting awful. I mean, these students are going overseas during summer break, and they're seeing these cathedrals, and some of them will come to me later and will say, well, Dr. Blake, that building is much bigger than you seem to have described it. And I said, we've got to do something. And so my enterprising wife, and she was enterprising, one of the best organized people that I've ever run into, she says, well, we are going to go. We'll take the whole family, and we'll spend 5 or 6 weeks in Europe, and we'll see all these things. How about that? I said, fine. And so she planned it all out. She didn't know the cathedrals the way I did, but she knew how to move around Europe, and I knew where the cathedrals were. In fact, in her journal, I just was reading in portions of it yesterday, we'd been in England for a week on that. We were in Europe for 8 weeks, and we're in 10 different countries. And I was reading her journal about the first week in England, and she had written at the end of the first week, 17 cathedrals so far. And she got just a little weary, I think, of cathedrals because I wanted to go into all of them, and I wanted to go all the way to the top of all of them, which I always did. It'd be a real challenge for me now, but in any event. You're going to see a lot of English cathedrals today. I was telling you about Dick Dilworth. Dick Dilworth is a real Anglophile. He and his wife Joan had been to England about 65 or 66 times. They would go over and rent a house in various parts of England and would make that their base, and they would go out from there. And Dick took many, many slides. And so in preparation for this lecture, I thought maybe, well, we needed some pictures this time for the people. You can't really talk about architecture unless you show a few pictures. One of the tragedies of my move was that to my house to here is that I misplaced all my slides, and I couldn't find any of them. But I knew Dick Dilworth would come. I met him in the early 70s, and he would come to my classes at VCU when I was in this particular section of medieval history, and he would lecture with his slides. And so I called his wife Joan, and I said, "Joan, do you ever give Dick's lectures?" She says, "My goodness, no. But you can have all of his slides. I can't think of anybody I'd like to have the slides." And he has such slides. He's visited all. There are 42 Anglican cathedrals in England, and Dick had been to all of those, plus the Catholic cathedrals, a total about 63 cathedrals that Dick had slides of. So some of these slides are certainly, in fact, most of them are inspired by Dick's slides. So Joan and Dick Dilworth. Dick was a great friend of mine. All right, well, the slide, as I said, you see here is not a cathedral at all. It is a parish church. That is a church in a diocese, hadn't been raised to the level of cathedral. Some churches have been raised to the level of cathedral, but this church in Tewkesbury. But it's a very beautiful church, very lovely church, and this beautiful vaulting would be about the 14th century. This is, let's see, I think we skipped a slide. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, this is the interior of the church, showing the vaulting that is in the church, and that holds up the ceiling. This is a church now. This is not an English church at all. This is a church just to the north of Paris, probably a part of Paris now. This is the church of Saint-Denis, the Abbey of Saint-Denis. That's Saint St. period Denis, and it's pronounced Saint-Denis. It's named after, well, the story is that it goes all the way back to a disciple of St. Paul and comes on through the Middle Ages. In fact, in the early, about 250, during a Roman persecution by a Roman emperor named Decius, Decius had Denis, before he became a saint, had him beheaded on what is now, or so the story goes, what is now Montmartre in Paris. The Moulin Rouge is up on Montmartre. Some of y'all have, a good many of you have been to these places, I know. We went to so many of them in 1970 on that trip that we took around Europe. But this is the church where Gothic architecture began. One of the great leaders of 12th century thought was a abbot, a monk, abbot of Saint-Denis. His name was Suger. spelled S-U-G-E-R, Abbot Suger, the abbot of this church. Only it didn't look like that in the 1040s when Abbot in the 1140s. It didn't look like that. It was Suger who turned it into looking like that. Now, when you compare this to some of the cathedrals I'll show you in a few moments, you'll say, "Well, my goodness, that's hardly worth calling a cathedral." But it is a cathedral. It's the Royal Abbey in Paris. There are 70 kings buried, 70 French kings buried in this abbey. The royal regalia is housed in this abbey. Suger was a highly intelligent man in the 12th century, the first half of the 12th century. He spent most of his life in this abbey. He only left it for a few days in his whole lifetime. Most of his time was spent here. And he became convinced that looking at Greek philosophy, as well as his Christian background, he determined that the ultimate expression of divinity, of the divine, was light. And the church it was Romanesque at first, with small windows and thick walls and rounded arches, the characteristics of Romanesque architecture. And he wanted more light, and so in order to do this, he needed to raise the walls. The walls would become thinner. He would put windows in the sides of the building, and then in the west front, he puts a rose window. Now you see that tiny rose window. In fact, the rose window in Washington Cathedral is much more beautiful than this one. But this is the beginning. I mean, this is this style of architecture that is started by Suger in the 1140s is the first real change in architecture for 1700 years. You'd have to go back to the ancient Greeks in order to find a new style of architecture. And this, as much as you might think when you see this compared to others, that how in the world can you be excited about that? But this is the first example in Suger of Gothic architecture, is this building. What Suger said, and we know what he said because he keeps notes, and we have those notes that he wrote. He also was the biographer of two kings, Louis VI and Louis VII, the two that remember that Louis VII went on the second crusade. And he wrote biographies of both of those kings. Well, he didn't finish the one on Louis VII, but he started that. But he wrote widely, and he wrote about how he oversaw the rebuilding of this building to make it taller, to make the arches become a bit more pointed. Instead, you still have the rounded arches over the door, which show the Romanesque influence, but he raises the walls. He doesn't. I mean, he's not a mathematician. These things had to be figured out very carefully, and they never knew for sure that after they had been constructed that they would continue to stand. Later on, in the French city of Beauvais, once the Gothic buildings, Gothic churches began to be built on wide scale, it was not simply a religious or spiritual matter, It was a question of rivalry between cities. A city trying to put up the biggest cathedral, the tallest cathedral, the largest cathedral. And Beauvais tried to put one up, and they got it to enormous height, and it collapsed. And the only thing you can go to Beauvais now, and you can see the building. The only thing left is the choir and the altar area. There's no nave at all to the church, but it was a huge affair. Well, anyway, this is the idea that he had. He wanted to bring light on the altar, so he constructed it in such a way that there was light coming in contrast to the dark interior of Romanesque structures. So this is Suger, the founder of Gothic architecture, and the church where it began, the Church of Saint-Denis in Paris. To finish the story about Saint-Denis, he was beheaded on Montmartre, and the legend has it that he picked up his head and walked with it across town and came to this particular spot. And this is why a church was built there, and the church is called Saint-Denis after him. All right. Now you may have thought that that church looked kind of unimpressive, but this is the interior of the Church of Saint-Denis, and you can see that it's quite an impressive interior, and you can see how he was able to bring so much light into that building. When it was in its Romanesque stage, you wouldn't have begun to see anything like that, such a lighted interior. But his purpose was to, and also he had a great concern for the people in the town. He wanted a place where the people could feel a real strong spirit of the divine, and so they were kind of flooded with light when they came into Saint-Denis. All right, now we're going to take a look at some English cathedrals now. And I'm going to begin by showing you what sometimes called the first four that I'll show you are sometimes called the four top cathedrals in England. This one, all of these, most I'm going to show you, at least 7 out of 8 of the next slides I'm going to show you were churches built between 1066 and 1100. And so you've got 7 of the cathedrals I'm going to show you now that were built in that period. 3 of the ones that are regarded as the top cathedrals, and 3 of the 4 were built in the period between 1066 and 1100. This is Durham Cathedral, and is regarded as one of the finest Norman cathedrals in England. That's looking at it from the front of the facade of the building, and you notice that you do have one little bit of Gothic touch. You've got a pointed arch over the front window in this structure. I'm sorry, it's just a little muddled. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but this is an aerial view of the same building, and you can see the tower over the transept. Transept is the part of the building that goes across the elongated piece, and the front over here on the front of the building, and the front of the building is up here. The tower, the transept, goes across right here. This is what's called the clerestory. That's the 3rd story. There's a 2nd story called the triforium, and then you have the arcade is the lowest floor in these buildings. So the arcade, the triforium, and the clerestory. And the clerestory where most of the light, come to see, where's my, right here. This is the clerestory in the building. It's a very impressive cathedral, sits on a high hill. There's a castle right next to it, and both of them, when you can see it very clearly when the train goes by on the way to Newcastle on Tyne. In fact, this is the northernmost cathedral in England except Newcastle. Newcastle on Tyne also is a cathedral city. And then you go into Scotland after Newcastle. This, of course, most of you recognize this right away. And who call it out? What's this one? Anybody recognize it? This is the Cathedral of Canterbury, and second of the topmost churches. A lovely cathedral. Again, it was started in about 1070, I think 1070, and so just about 4 years. It's one of the earliest of the churches, the Norman churches that William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, started. And I mean, it's just amazing how many churches began to go up after the Norman conquest in 1066. As I said, within 30 years, you've got at least there are at least 8 cathedrals built between 1066 and 1100. One of the things to note about this cathedral is that you have two transepts, one here and one here. It's not the only church with double transepts like this, but it is one of the churches. And here, way down in the where's my the front entrance into the church building. And of course, this is a church that Thomas Becket was slain when King Henry II was troubled by the fact that Thomas Becket would not bow down to follow the king's way of dealing with the papacy and with the whole reform of the church. And as we all know, he said, cried out aloud, who will rid me of this troublesome archbishop? And 4 of his knights overheard him, and while Becket was kneeling in prayer in the church, he was slain. And of course, Canterbury became a great pilgrimage center. People came from all over England, and of course, you've got the famous story of the pilgrims coming to the church here to remember Thomas Becket. So now we go back up north. Back up north, not too far. About this is about in the east and on the midway, not quite midway up toward going north. This is Lincoln Cathedral, and there are some who argue that this is the most beautiful cathedral in all of England. It's awfully hard to pick one out and to say one is more beautiful than the other. But there's a castle directly across the street from the church. It's not shown here. And you can stand, and my guess is, we go back to this again, that when this photo was taken, somebody was standing on the wall of the castle opposite, because that's the kind of view that you get of that. And if you look again, you can see that, as in the case of Canterbury, this one also is noted for having 2 transepts, that is, two cross pieces that go across. And usually, one of the transepts, there's going to be the tower, and that's true of Lincoln Cathedral. This is a different one. This is one of the one of the top cathedrals that was not built between 1066 and 1100. This one was built a little bit into the 12th century. I think this one's probably dated about 1112, 1114. This is Wells Cathedral, W-E-L-L-S, Wells Cathedral, which is over in the west of England, over near Bristol, and there you'll see another cathedral. Ely Cathedral is also, Ely is over in the east. So this is Wells Cathedral, and one of the things that it's noted for is the statuary that is in the front. There are 300 different statues sculpted on the facade of this church, Wells Cathedral. The English churches, I mean, if you go into any of these cathedrals now, you're walking into something very different than, say, when they were erected in the 12th century. And many of them were put up, some of them were put up as quickly. Salisbury Cathedral, for instance, was put up in about 35 years, which was amazing. Most of them take 100 years, 150, and of course, keep adding to and taking away. But these cathedrals will be very different now than when you would have gone into them in the 12th century, because they've suffered all kinds of depredations by the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The reformers believed that much that was depicted in the stained glass windows or much that was depicted in the statuary was idolatrous, and so these were destroyed wholesale. I mean, it's terrible to think of the great destruction of these buildings that was done by the Protestant Reformation. And if that wasn't bad enough, then a century later, during the English Revolution, Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans came along, and what the reformers had not accomplished, the Puritans almost completed. Although there are some who argue that is, some real purists about these cathedrals argue that more damage was done by the Victorians, alterations on these cathedrals in the 19th century than was done by either the Reformation or by the Puritans. My friend Dick Dilworth argues, and he was certainly he studied these cathedrals very carefully, but he said that the Victorians did more damage to these than the Germans did in the air raids in 1940. So whether he's informed on that or whether it's just a kind of hunch of his, I'm not sure. But this is Wells Cathedral. There's an aerial view of the cathedral, and you can see the wonderful cloister over here on the left, as one of the most beautiful of all the cloisters in England. Chapter house where the clergy would meet for important discussions and decisions, and so that's Wells Cathedral. This is Ely Cathedral. Very different, but what's interesting about it is that you might think that it looks so different from the rest of them. It must be, it was built much later than some of the others. As a matter of fact, it was built it was one of those built in the period between 1066 and 1100. And so it is a very different cathedral. This cathedral is the only cathedral in England that has a completely timber roof in it. The whole interior. I wish I had a good slide of it, but I don't have a slide of it. But this is Peterborough Cathedral. Peterborough Cathedral was noted because when Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded, her body lay here in Peterborough Cathedral until a later time when her son, King James I, had her body moved from Peterborough to Westminster Abbey, which, by the way, is a very large church, and many people think it's a cathedral, but Westminster Abbey is not a cathedral. And anyway, now Mary Queen of Scots' body or tomb is right across the aisle from Elizabeth I, who was her tormentor, as many of you well know. But this is Peterborough Cathedral, and not too far from London, maybe 100 miles, if that many. This is quite a Romanesque kind of church, cathedral. This is Gloucester Cathedral. Gloucester Cathedral, which is almost over on the border between England and Wales. As you can see, it's pretty impressive building. You would think when you look at Durham that we started out with, or look at Gloucester like this, that you really get into a large cathedral. But the largest cathedral in England was fairly recently built, and it's in Liverpool. The Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool is the largest cathedral in England, larger than St. Paul's, larger than any other church in England. Well, when you look at this, you start singing, don't you? Because this is Winchester Cathedral, you're bringing me down. Well, this is Winchester Cathedral. And the important thing about Winchester Cathedral, one of the things that differs English cathedrals from European cathedrals is that the English cathedrals tend to be longer, more plain, and of course they're Protestant now instead of Catholic. That's one of the differences. And this one has the longest nave. This nave is 556 feet long. The Washington Monument is 555 feet tall, so you can lay the Washington Monument down in the nave of Winchester Cathedral, which is a striking thing. Then it's always nice to have people around in the pictures, because it gives you some idea of what you're dealing with. I mean, you can imagine, I mean, well, let me just go back to what I was starting. You can imagine how impressive these buildings, these structures were when they were first built. I mean, it's obviously the biggest and most beautiful building that anybody in any town in England where they were built, the largest, most beautiful, most inspiring structure that the people had ever seen, and even to this day they are. I mean, particularly when we get to some of the European cathedrals, which are far larger than the English cathedrals. But this is Winchester Cathedral. This is Norwich Cathedral, and you see it has quite a tower. The tower wasn't built. It was pretty Gothic when it was first built. It was built between 1066 and 1100. This is one of those, and the tower was added a couple of centuries later, and that tower is the second tallest tower of all of the churches in England. It's over 300 feet. I think about 305 feet. That's the front entrance into that, and you can see the tower behind it. But this is Norwich Cathedral, as a second tallest spire of all the English churches. Norwich is famous for one of the saints that in the 13th century. Her name was Julian, Julian, Julian of Norwich. She was one of the great medieval mystics. She had any number of visions, and she wrote down what these visions, and you and I are fortunate that we can read her visions. And Norwich was her hometown. So this is Norwich Cathedral, and then this is Exeter Cathedral. Exeter Cathedral. Again, wonderful sculptures in the front facade there. The Gothic churches would have broad entrances and the great sculptures all around, rose window, pointed arches, flying buttresses to reinforce the walls so that you could make them thinner and put larger and larger windows in them, inspired by Suger. But this is Exeter Cathedral. Exeter is down in the southwestern part of England. This is often picked as one of the favorites in England. It's hard to get, it's so big, it's one of the biggest in England. This is York Cathedral, and it's hard to find a place to stand to take a picture of the front. You'd hate to cut down that tree in order to get a better view of the front facade of York Cathedral. This is a shot of it from the transept, and you can see what an impressive transept that is, with the great tower over the transept, York Cathedral. And now this is not a cathedral, but it's an impressive piece of architecture. Was built 4 centuries later than most of our pictures that I've shown you. This is Bath Abbey. Bath is located over near Gloucester. This is a side view of Bath Abbey, and you can see this is the highest Gothic area highest Gothic style that you can find in English church architecture. But I just put this in because of the beauty of Bath Abbey. Bath Abbey is over near Bristol. It is near Wells Cathedral. They are all kind of Gloucester. Bath Abbey and Wells are all located just about around the city of Bristol in western England. Well, you move to an entirely different style at a much later period of time. You are now in the 17th century. The Great Fire of England in the 1660s had burned down the old St. Paul's, and one of the greatest of the English architects, Christopher Wren, designed and built this building. And the style is classical, the classical style. You can see the columns look like Greek columns, and the whole structure is classical. This is another view of it. If you've been to England in more recent times, say in the last 10 years, no, even before that, in 2000. In 2000, a new bridge, a walking bridge, was built across the Thames from the South Bank to the North Bank, and so it's called the Millennium Bridge. And it when you come to this end of it, you are right in front of this building. I mean, in fact, the bridge runs from that side to this side of the Thames, and then when you get off the bridge, you're right in front. This is the view that you will get of St. Paul's Cathedral. I remember in one of the cathedrals of the 17 that my wife mentioned in her journal, it was St. Paul's, and she talked about how Bill wanted to go up to the highest point of all of them. And I did go to the highest point here, and I've got some wonderful photos, if I can ever find them, taken from the tower up here. So yeah, you could do that then, but you can't do that in many of the churches now because of the vandalism that has begun to transpire in England. Another shot, that's the same. Okay, what's this one? Salisbury, okay. This is Salisbury down in Somerset, and it has the largest, as you probably can see, but that tower it's only 404 feet tall, 404 feet tall, but it's the tallest tower of any cathedral in England. But that's Salisbury Cathedral, very beautiful. Another shot of Salisbury Cathedral from the front, and you see the tower. They're doing some repair when that particular shot was taken. This church, going back again, the main structure, the tower did come later, but that was the case. And many times the tower would be made of wood. And if you have a windstorm, as in the case of Norwich, the wind blew that spire down, and it was rebuilt a couple centuries later. This very, very impressive, beautiful, and of course the usual picture of it is taken across the river, and this was painted by, is it Monet, who painted the famous portraits of this cathedral. Okay, we come to a very interesting, this is Coventry, and during World War II, Coventry Cathedral on the left was bombed by the Germans, and in one of the blitzes, and some of the church, the steeple, which you can see in the background there, the steeple stood, this part of the walls of the building stood, and then in this century, in the period between, say, after World War II, you have the new structure right here, the new building. Let me get the new building. Famous. This is St. Michael's. This is St. Michael's Church. This was St. Michael's in Coventry. Coventry, of course, is the same place where Lady Godiva also happened to reside, and there's also she's on her horse in another part of the town. But this is Michael the Archangel having conquered the devil, Satan. A very impressive sculpture, and I wish I had some slides to show you the interior of this building, because it's a very, very beautiful interior, very modern, of course, and the doors are etched with angels about 20 feet tall in there, and then over the altar is a tapestry of the risen Christ, a very modern tapestry of the risen Christ. But this is Coventry. Here's the tower that survived the bombing, and then you say, well, why didn't they rebuild the old one? They wanted to leave it as a testament against war, and so instead of tearing this down and trying to rebuild it, they decided to add on. I think it was a good idea, because I think you've got a great contrast between the old cathedral and a brand new cathedral. Incidentally, I mentioned that there were 42 Anglican cathedrals in England, but a total of 63 Roman, and so you add about 20 Roman Catholic cathedrals that stand in England now. Of course, they weren't standing in the 16th century or in the Cromwellian period, but they've been built since then. And some of the most beautiful new cathedrals are Roman Catholic cathedrals. There's one in Liverpool, the same place that you have the largest Anglican cathedral in England, and also you've got a brand new, a very beautiful Catholic cathedral, and then in Bristol there is a very, very beautiful Catholic cathedral. In 1970, when my wife and 3 children bought a car at Bradley's down across from Monroe Park and had it delivered in England with the steering wheel on the left-hand side, I mean the side that we drive on, but which made life a little difficult driving around in England with the driver here, and on your right is the you have your passenger. And so if you're on a single-lane highway and you want to pass the car in front of you, you ask the person sitting next to you, is it clear? And you have to have a good deal of trust in their powers of observation and in their reports to you. But we drove all over 10 different countries, but we spent 2 weeks in England and Scotland, and then we crossed the English Channel, and we came across this cathedral right away. And I'll tell you the truth, I don't know when I felt so little and so blown away, because I thought I'd seen the heights of cathedrals, and all the Durham Cathedral and Canterbury and Ely and Norwich and all the great English cathedrals, but this one dwarfs them. I mean, this is one of the largest cathedrals, not the largest cathedral in the world, but certainly one of the largest. The largest cathedral is in the German city of Ulm, U-L-M. Ulm Cathedral is the largest with the highest spires in Europe. 555 feet is the height of the spire at Ulm. But this is Amiens Cathedral, A-M-I-E-N-S, I think. Amiens, and this cathedral, you can put 2 Notre Dame cathedrals inside this cathedral. So to give you some idea of the how large a cathedral this is. And so you begin to find cathedrals about this size all around. And this is Notre Dame, and of course before the fire. And I'm glad they made the decision that they were not going to tear this down and start over, but they've got a lot of work to do, because that was a terribly ruinous fire that struck. Okay, now this is a rather small cathedral in France, comparatively. This is the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare at Autun, A-U-T-O-N. And I say the Church of St. Lazarus. And so one of the interesting things in 1970 that we experienced was that you could, when we got to this church, there was nobody around. I mean, there were no priests, nobody standing around to direct you any place. You could just, the doors were open, you just walk right in. And one of the most sought after pilgrimage sites is in this building, and no pilgrims were that day except for us. And here was this big glass case in front of the altar, and there was a skull and bones in that case. And whose were they? Lazarus. I mean, the guy that was dead 4 days and Jesus restored to life. And so you can go into the Church of Saint-Lazare, which of course St. Lazarus, and you can see Lazarus' skull and bones. unfortunately, when I made the move here, and I told you I lost them, so I had a great slide of that altar. All I've got now is a few pieces of his thumb in this reliquary in the same church of Saint Lazare. And my guess is in this photo that the tomb that I'm talking about, or at least that this is the edge of it. And if you move this way, and I hate to tempt you like this, but I mean, if you move this way, you can see the whole skull and bones. I mean, I know you just love to see Lazarus' skull and bones, but in any event, one of the great reliquary centers in Europe. We just happened to stumble upon this. I think I'd lost my way, and we happened to come onto the city because I'd never heard of it before. But Church of Saint Lazare. Go back here just a second. Another important thing about Church of Saint Lazare, and I wish I had known all of what I know now about this church and about the sculptor. I would have appreciated everything much more. But this is the only cathedral in Europe that, and it was built in about the early 1300s, and the sculptor was a man by the name of Geislabertus. And Geislabertus, unlike the sculptures that appear, say for instance of Wells Cathedral, I told you there were 300 sculptures on the front of Wells Cathedral. In this cathedral at Autun, and the sculptures in all the other places are very elongated. The people don't look natural. They're just standing up straight, and they're all very slim. But Geislabertus has rounded sculpture. I mean, his sculptures are almost sensual. They're so carefully three-dimensional sculptures. Other sculptures are almost two-dimensional, but his are thoroughly three-dimensional. And he's the only one who says, I want you to know who did these sculptures. And so all you see here is Geislabertus, but if I had the whole panel, it says, I, Geislabertus, did this. I mean, so he wants you to know that he was a sculptor who did these. Well, this is the cathedral at Milan, and I remember that my two sons, one was 17, the other was 12 at the time. We climbed up and we stood right behind these the sculptures, or the can't think what to call them right now. But anyway, we stand right here, and my wife and daughter were down here, and they took a photo of us peeking through these lattice-like carvings on the great cathedral of Milan, the great fashion center in Europe now. Let's see. Come on here. Okay. Well, this continues to be the largest cathedral in certainly in Europe. I think maybe it's African cathedral now, that's a cathedral in Africa, which may be larger than St. Peter's, but this is St. Peter's Church in Rome, the Vatican, and again, we went all the way up to here, and I remember standing behind, standing behind these sculptures right here. St. Peter, Christ is in the middle, and Peter on one side, and we were able to do. You can't do these things anymore because of the vandalism. It wasn't too long after 1970. I've forgotten exactly what year it was, but you remember that a vandal broke into I say broke into, you didn't have to break in. You could walk into St. Peter's Church and hammered off the arm of the Pietà, the famous Michelangelo Pietà in the church. And so churches started forbidding people to go to those sites or to go only with guides by the church. You finally come to one of the great cathedrals and the highest towers, next to the highest towers. I told you that the highest tower on church is at the Cathedral of Ulm, ULM, a Lutheran cathedral in Germany. But this is in Köln, or Cologne, as we say it in English. This is the cathedral in Köln, and what a massive building it is. The towers are the second tallest, and of course, if you want to say twin towers, this is unique in that they are the tallest twin-towered churches in all of Europe. This is the Cathedral of Cologne, and it was very fortunate that the Allies did not drop bombs in such a way as to deface or destroy any part of this great cathedral. So I've tried to give you some indication of the kind of church architecture that started in the 12th century with Abbot Suger at the rather small church of Saint-Denis on the outskirts of northeastern Paris to some of the great cathedral constructions on the European continent. So appreciate you finding where we were today. As far as I know, unless I hear differently, they won't be giving flu shots anymore, and we'll meet in the Cochrane Commons for our last lecture next Monday, which will be on literature and poetry and drama and mysticism. And we'll take a look at some of the, I mentioned Julian of Norwich today. We'll take a look at one of the greatest of the 12th century female mystics. I don't know why I always have trouble saying her name, Art. Help me out. Hildegard of Bingen, right. St. Hildegard, Hildegard of Bingen. So we'll talk about her and some other women. 12th century is 12th century and 13th century is very important for women in Europe. I've said very little about women so far, but we'll talk a good deal about the contribution of women in the 12th century Renaissance. So thank you again. I think our time is up. Oh my goodness, it's 4:02. Okay, all right. Okay, well, thanks for coming, and we'll